I'm going to do a reading. It's relatively short. I've never been a long reader. I don't trust long readers. I have a theory that if you can't gauge an audience in the room and know when to get off the stage, you sure as hell won't know how to end a chapter. I became a writer for a lot of reasons. Many of them, I think one of the ways that my career can be most easily explained is I'm the bastard child of Pulp Fiction and high art. I'm a great apprentice at the feet of the great masters, who we all consider the great masters, Fitzgerald and Dostoevsky and Edith Wharton and Jane Austen. But I was also totally enthralled since a little kid with people like Jim Thompson and later James Ellroy, and then nothing more so since I was 8 years old, gangster movies. Love gangster movies. My all-time favorite sub-genre is the gangster movie. My all-time favorite sub-genre is the gangster movie set in the 1920s. Because the clothes were the coolest clothes of all time. And the cars were the coolest cars of all time. And this sounds like an NRA advertisement, which if you know anything about me, would not be me. But the guns were really cool. So ever since when I was a little kid, I'd go over to my Uncle Dennis's house on Saturday nights, every Saturday night, and the relatives would all go in the back room, and they would, in the kitchen, and they would sit and they would drink highballs, and they would talk about the old country. And me and my uncle would sit in the living room, and we would watch the Jimmy Cagney double feature on Channel 38. And it's one of my major inspirations. If you can't, I think, fully understand Mr. Wimber if you don't realize that I'm paying a little bit of an homage to late 1920s, early 1930s Warner Brothers movies. Having said all that, the major reason you should write, for those of you who are writing students, please never forget this lesson. Please never forget this rule. You should always write the book you want to read. It should be your first law. Not the book you think you should read. Not the book that people tell you you should read. Not the book that people say is the fashion of our time at the moment, but the book you most want to read. And that will also provide a little bit of a tough yardstick for you too, because you have to be scrupulously honest with yourself. Do you really want to read a book that opens with 20 pages of a character who seems a little bit like a more altruistic version of you sitting around a room thinking about her life? You probably don't. Now you know how you should feel about the first 15 short stories you've ever written. So, the other thing, my other rule as a writer, don't take this to heart yet. You got to get a little bit of muscle under your belt. You got to get your 10,000 hours, or certainly 6,000 of them. I can only write things that scare me. I can't get out of bed to write unless something about the project scares me. Unless it's something I haven't done before, unless it's setting a different bar for myself. So one day I woke up very recently and said, it's time to do my gangster book. So this is my gangster book. This is not out yet. It's not even finished yet. Let's be honest, it's not even close to finished yet. But I'm going to read from it because it's fun to read from. It doesn't need much of an introduction. It's a gangster book. It is somewhat of a sequel to The Given Day, my book set in 1919. In that book, there was a white family and a black family. The youngest child of the white family, which was a police officer's family. I always intended to grow up to be a gangster. And so this is the book picking up with that character 6 years after the end of The Given Day. So I'm just going to read this and then I'm going to take some questions. Just a note, just in case, I like to do this. Most of you, I think, have read my work. I hope some of you have. That means that if there are certain four-letter words that offend you, you're going to hear them. So I hope there's nobody in this audience who's unprepared for that. And I don't see any children, so I think we're safe. Okay. All right, here we go. I'm just going to read this chapter and take some questions. Joe Coughlin met Emma Gould at 7 o'clock in the morning on October 5th, 1925, when he and the Barlow brothers robbed the payroll room of the Gillette Company in South Boston. Joe and the two brothers wore hats pulled down over their eyes, and black handkerchiefs covered the lower halves of their faces. They carried pistols. Both Barlow brothers were big, beefy, and loud, but Emma Gould did not seem unsettled. Everyone else acted in respectful fashion. They shook uncontrollably, or made those little peeps folks made in crisis, and the office manager tried to conceal the dark stain that appeared on the inner thighs of his brown serge suit. The office manager, a huge guy, was having trouble finding the key for the dispersers room. Dion Barlow prodded him by running the muzzle of his .38 up and down the back of his head, but it just made the big man's nerves worse. Emma Gould kept her hands on her head, but walked toward the two of them. "May I help?" Dion Barlow pointed his pistol at her chest. It slowed her, but didn't stop her. "Mr. Pilcher has a lot of keys on his ring," she said, "and I use those keys a lot more than he does." She looked over at Joe and seemed to decide he was the leader. "May I help Mr. Pilcher find the correct key?" "Be my guest." He couldn't get over how level her gaze was. She looked at him for an extra second before turning to help the office manager, and he was certain she could see his face behind the handkerchief and the low hat. She said, "Here, Mr. Pilcher, I'll take them." 10 seconds later, she turned the key in the door. Joe went inside for the canvas bags, the money still waiting to be counted and sorted and placed in the drawers of the disbursement cashiers. When Joe came back out, Pilcher was lying on his side, bound and gagged, as the Barlow brothers started trussing the assistant office manager and the secretary. Emma Gould said to him, "Ropes on the desk." It was. One of the Barlows had left a length of rope coiled in the corner of the nearest metal desk. Joe couldn't get over her. Ropes on the desk, like she was telling him where he left his house keys. He picked up the rope and she turned her back to him and crossed her arms behind her, her knuckles pressed against the small of her back, the fingertips dangling over her ass. Joe realized the last thing he should be doing is concentrating on anyone's ass, period. He made the first loop around her wrists. "I'll be gentle. You don't have to put yourself out on my account." She looked back over her shoulder at him. "Just try not to leave any marks." "Jesus. What's your name?" "Emma Gould," she said. "What's yours?" "Wanted. By all the girls or just the law?" He couldn't keep up with her and watch the clock and cover the entrances at the same time, so he turned her to him and pulled the gag out of his pocket. The gags were men's socks that Paulo Barlow stole from the Woolworths where he worked. "You gonna put a sock in my mouth?" "Yes, a sock in my mouth." "It's never been used before," Joe said, "I promise." She cocked an eyebrow. It was the same blue-black as her hair and soft and shiny as ermine. "I wouldn't lie to you," Joe said. It felt in the moment as if he were telling the truth. "Yeah, that's usually what liars say," she said. She opened her mouth like a child resigned to a spoonful of medicine, and he thought of saying something else to her, but he couldn't think of what. He thought of asking her something, just so he could hear her voice again. But Dion clapped his hands and said, "Chop, chop," and the clock above the door told Joe they'd reached the 5-minute exposure limit that he himself had imposed, and yet her eyes pulsed a bit when he pushed the sock into her mouth, and then she tried to spit it out. They usually did, shaking her head as she saw the length of tape in his hand, but he was ready for her. He clamped his hand over her mouth and smoothed the ends of the tape against her cheeks. She looked at him as if, until this point, the whole transaction had been perfectly honorable, a kick even, but now he'd gone and sullied it. "It's half silk," he said. "The sock." When they left, they drove along the waterfront. The sky was a hard blue streaked with hard yellow. The gulls rose and fell cawing. The bucket of a ship crane swung in hard over the wharf road, then swung back with a scream as Paulo drove over its shadow. Longshoremen and teamsters stood at their pilings, smoking in the bright cold. A group of them threw rocks at the gulls. Joe rolled down his window, took the cold air on his face and against his eyes. It smelled like fish, salt, and gasoline. Dion Barlow looked back at him from the front seat. "You asked the doll her name?" Joe said, "Just making conversation." "You tie her hands like you're putting a pin on her, asking her to dance?" Joe leaned his head out the open window for a minute, sucked the dirty air in as deep as he could. Paulo drove off the docks and up onto Broadway. The Nash Roadster doing 30 miles an hour easy. "I've seen her before," Paulo said. Joe pulled his head back in the car. "Where?" "I don't know, but I did. I know it. He bounced an ash onto Broadway, and they all bounced with it." "You should write her a poem, maybe." "Write her a fucking poem," Joe said. "Why don't you slow down and stop driving like we did something?" Dion turned toward Joe, placed his arm on the seat back. "He actually wrote a poem to a girl once, my brother." "No kidding?" Paulo met his eyes in the rearview mirror and gave him a solemn nod. "So what happened?" "Nothing," Dion said. "She couldn't read." They headed south toward Dorchester and got stuck in traffic by a horse that had dropped dead just outside Andrew Square. Traffic had to be routed around it in its overturned cart of ice. Shards of ice glistened in the cobblestone cracks like metal shavings, and the iceman stood beside the carcass, kicking the horse in the ribs. Joe thought about her the whole way. Her hands had been dry and soft, and very small and pink at the base of the palms. The veins in her wrist were violet. She had a black freckle on the back of her right ear, but not on her left. The Barlow brothers lived on Dorchester Avenue above a butcher and a cobbler. The butcher and the cobbler had married sisters and hated each other only slightly less than they hated their wives. This didn't stop them, however, from running a speakeasy out of their shared basement. Nightly, people came from the other 16 parishes of Dorchester, as well as from parishes as far away as the North Shore, to drink the best liquor south of Montreal, and hear a Negro songstress named Delilah Duluth sing about heartbreak in a place whose unofficial name was the Shoelace, which infuriated the butcher so much he'd gone bald over it. The Barlow brothers were in the Shoelace almost every other night, which was fine, but going so far as to reside above the place seemed idiotic to Joe. It would only take one legitimate raid by honest cops or T-men, however unlikely a scenario that was, and it would be nothing for them to kick in Dion and Paulo's door and discover money, guns, and jewelry, and two wops who worked in a department store and a grocery respectively would never account for it. True, the jewelry usually went right back out the door to Jaime Drago, the fence they'd been using since they were 15, but the money usually went no further than a gaming table in the back of the Shoelace or into their mattresses. Joe leaned against the icebox and watched Paulo put his and his brother's split there that morning. He just pulled back the sweat-yellowed sheet to reveal one of a series of slits that cut into the side. Dion handed the stacks of bills to Paulo, and Paulo shoved them in like he was stuffing a holiday bird. Paulo rose from the floor. "I know where I seen her." He slapped the dust off his knees. Joe came off the icebox. "Where?" "Oh yeah, but he's not sweet on it," Dion said. "Where?" Joe repeated. Paulo pointed at the floor. "Downstairs." "In the Shoelace?" Paulo nodded. "She come in with Albert." "Albert who?" "Albert the King of Montenegro," Dion said. "Albert, who do you think?" Unfortunately, there was only one Albert in Boston who could be referred to without a last name. Albert White, former hero of the Philippine-Moro Wars, former policeman who lost his job in the aftermath of the strike in 1919. Owner of White Garage and Automotive Glass Repair, formerly Halloran's Tire and Automotive. Owner of White's Downtown Cafe, formerly Halloran's Lunch Counter. Owner of White's Freight and Transcontinental Shipping, formerly Halloran's Trucking. Rumored to have personally rubbed out Bitsy Halloran. Bitsy got himself shot 11 times in an oak phone booth inside a Rexall drugstore in Eggleston Square. So many shots fired at such close range, it set the booth on fire. Another rumor had it that Albert bought the charter reins of the phone booth, had it restored, kept it in the study of the home he owned on Ashmont Hill, made all his calls from it.